except for our seals or something. Okay, well, this is where we were last time. Go right around here, okay? So they were looking for they found syphilis, and they're going, oh, this is kind of exciting. Now, maybe all mental illnesses have an organic reason. So they started looking for reasons for bipolar disorder, depression, and all the rest of it. And what they discovered was nothing. They found nothing, unfortunately. We're still looking, of course. There's always a possibility. But they're finding nothing. With very few exceptions, there are no laboratory tests that can be conducted to detect the presence or absence of a mental disorder. We can't draw your blood and find out if you're depressed. We can't draw your blood and discover whether you're anxious or not. Unfortunately, we can't do that. It doesn't work that way. If you have leukemia, we can draw your blood and determine that. If you have a problem with your liver, we can draw your blood and we can determine what's going on with your liver. But there's no test for any of the mental illnesses, unfortunately. A precise physical cause has never been found for most of the DSM-5 diagnoses. So everything in the DSM-5, they are mental illnesses. They're not physical illnesses. And for that reason, there's nothing we can do to find them out. About the time that Kraepelin was changing the treatment habits in mental hospitals, the psychogenic perspective was gaining steam. Many people believe that the psychogenic approach began with Sigmund Freud. It's all in your head. He was looking at something they used to call hysteria. Hysteria was where you had physical ailments, but there was no physical reason for you to have ailments. The most famous case is the lady who saw her husband's penis. Well, back then, if you didn't look at those kinds of things, women didn't look at men's nether regions. They never saw them. She looked at her husband's penis and she was struck blind. Not because of his penis, but because she felt so guilty about it. And it caused her what they call hysterical blindness. Another famous case that Freud talked about was the lady that became paralyzed from the waist down. What happened to her? She moved during sex. But she wasn't supposed to move during sex. Only the man moved, not the woman. She moved, and she felt so guilty about it that she had hysterical paralysis. These kinds of things happen. It was a psychogenic reason for what was going on. So they had physical manifestations for something that was going on in their heads. They felt guilty. Therefore, of course, they couldn't move or see through their eyes because they saw the wrong thing. As odd as that seems. What would that do? We would well, maybe not all of us would be blind, but I mean, there's a lot of pornography on the internet, and we would all, well, not all of us, of course, maybe some of us, but sometimes you type in there, baby carriage, and all of a sudden, my God, it's anime all over again. Wait a minute, what does sex have to do with baby carriages? Nothing, but, if you don't have that filter turned on your computer, who knows what's going to happen next. Okay, so a lot of people think that Freud was the first guy that came up with this, but he's not really the first one to come up with it. He actually trained under Joseph Breuer, who was one of the first individuals to deal with the talking cure. In other words, I'm going to talk to you and make you feel good about things. This was 150 years ago, almost 175 years ago. And even to this day, if you go into a mental hospital, the talking cure is probably the best way that you can cure yourself. One of the things that we do know about men coming back from combat, the more interaction they have with other men coming back from combat, the more conversations they have with other individuals who've been through the same thing, the less likely they're going to have any symptoms. It's the talking cure. It works. And it still works to this day. One of the things that we try to do when somebody is suffering from anything, from any kind of a mental illness, is to get them to talk about it. If we can get them to talk about it, it's not as frightening if you're talking about it than if it's just in your head, because you play it over and over again in your head. So if you can talk about it, a lot of times it dissipates the severity of your feelings about whatever it is that has happened. The beginning of the psychogenic approach came with hypnotism, the power of suggestion controlling people's behavior. Individuals that used hypnotism, Anton Mesmerize, that's where the word mesmerize came from, Hippolyte Bernheim, and Ambrose Liebold. One of the modern perspectives on abnormal behavior is the sociocultural perspective. Really kind of fascinating. Socioculturalists do not believe in mental illness. One of the proponents of sociocultural theories is Thomas Zaz. He died last year. He feels that it is incorrect, or he felt that it was incorrect to look at an individual's behavior without taking into account the social roots of the abnormal behavior. So we have to look at the sociocultural structure of the individual, what he has been through in his life, to understand why he is reacting the way that he is. So I guess we could do this with the shooter up in Las Vegas. What was his sociocultural, what happened to him throughout his life? Do we know anything? Have we figured out anything? We know that he wore sweatpants and flip-flops, and he walked around Las Vegas for years, and sometimes bet millions of dollars a night. That's what they're saying now, but I'm not exactly sure what that means. If you're gambling $1 million a night, what does broke mean to you? I know what it means to me. It means I've got a lot of credit card debt and I've got a lot of debt. That's what it means. That's my wife keeps telling me. This is what being broke is, honey. Stop using your ATM card. That's what she keeps telling me. Stop giving people money. That's what she told me that today. Zaz has gone as far as to say that mental illness is a myth. It's a myth. It is merely an individual having problems living in a deviant society. So this is more of an individualistic way of looking at things. It's society that is bad, and it's the individual that is good. So we have a hard time living in this society because there is something wrong with our society. Not just this society, but any society. And it's the society that is bad. So if we had to live in, who were the ones that used to sacrifice people? The Aztecs? They used to collect the blood? Of the Aztecs. If we lived in that society, wow, that would be interesting. Is there something wrong with that society? Would there be something wrong with that society? If I didn't want to kill somebody, if I didn't want to sacrifice them and cut their hearts out so that I could, I don't know, do that heart, but if I wouldn't do that, is there something wrong with me? Because I won't do what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, okay. So if I'm in the military and they tell me to bomb that village, and I see little kids running around and I won't do it, is there something wrong with me, or is there something wrong with the military culture that tells me to do that? Okay. Yeah, probably the military culture that tells me to do that. If you read Chris Kyle's book, the very first page has him shooting a lady who's holding a little baby because she's pulled a hand grenade out of the folds of her clothes, and he can see it. So he shoots her, and the hand grenade goes off, killing the child, and of course he's killed the lady anyway. But
he's killed her, or she's killed herself?
He killed her. He shot her and killed her, and then she dropped a hand grenade, and the baby was killed.
If she didn't have a hand grenade,
the baby wouldn't have been killed.
yeah.
Now the question is, do you shoot a woman holding a baby? Would you shoot a woman holding a baby? Normally you wouldn't do it. If the hand grenade, I know.
Depends on the situation.
So, yeah, so what is the, is this a normal, is this society normal where a woman is running down the street with a baby and pulls a hand grenade out to throw it at the Marines? I think they're Marines. Anyway. So is it a deviant society or is it? Oh, yeah. It's just an insane situation. Sociocultural theorists feel that modern society stigmatizes individuals, giving them the label mentally ill, and thus increasing their alienation from society. So people are alienated because they are labeled as ADHD, because they're labeled as learning, having dyslexia, having a learning disability. They're labeled like that. So this is the person, this is the role that they have to take on. There's something wrong with you. Therefore, there's something wrong. And that's the sociocultural perspective. Sociocultural theorists also recognize that people are stigmatized by society due to their gender, due to their race, due to their ethnicity, their lifestyle, their poverty, and accumulative discrimination. So there is accumulative discrimination out there. And no matter who you are, well, maybe not, there's got to be somebody that's making up all these rules. Right? Somebody's got to be doing this. So who's on top, men or women? Who's in charge of stuff? Males or females? Which one is discriminated against? Males or females? Females are discriminated against. Do we all agree on that? Which race is on top in the United States? Well, let's look at Congress. What color are they? What race are they? What race is the President of the United States? It used to be an African American, wasn't it? Wasn't Barack Obama non-white? I was just curious. So, let's look at all the leaders in Congress. Let's see. Wait a minute, we've got Donald Trump. Is he, what race is he? I don't know, orange is right. Curious. Mitch McConnell, what race is he? Does anybody know where Mitch McConnell's from? He's from Kentucky. I don't know if that's important or not. It is to somebody from Indiana. Okay. And Ryan, I can't think of Ryan's first name. Paul, thank you. Paul, where's Paul from? Oh, what race is he? What race is he? He once claimed that he ran a sub 3-minute marathon. It was a lie. He's never done that. I think it was like 4 hours. 4-hour marathon, a 3-hour marathon. Did I say 3 minutes? 3 hours. I'm sorry. Paul Ryan. So what race is Paul Ryan? Oh, come on, he's white. And he's from Wisconsin. Okay. So who's in charge?
The people.
Yeah, right. The people are in charge.
Well, they can put themselves in power.
Somebody had to vote him in. Okay, so which race is in charge in the United States? White people, thank you, I was just curious. Ethnicity, sometimes people's ethnicity is stigmatized. Are there any stigmatized ethnic groups in the United States? No? Oh, that's great. I was worried there. Because all of a sudden we're thinking of kicking all these people out. Anybody that came recently, we're going to kick them all out. Are they of the different ethnic groups? Are they all Irish from Ireland, and Brits from England, and Germans from Germany? Lots of Germans. Who are the immigrants? People from Mexico? Okay. Oh, wait a minute, they just caught, who did they just caught 115 people in a semi-truck coming across the border, like over the weekend. 115 people, yeah. coming up from Mexico. I know. So ethnic groups. Immigrants coming in, Mexicans are not Mexican Americans, not yet, not until they become citizens. Is there any other groups that are denigrated in the United States? Any other ethnic groups?
White?
Whites are the good guys. They're the ones in charge. Who? Arabs, Muslims. Right. I was just curious. Lifestyle. How about lifestyle? Are there any people that are denigrated in the United States, discriminated against because of their lifestyle? Homosexuals?
Muslims.
Muslims because of their religion?
Yeah.
How about poor people? Who just got the biggest tax break in the history of the United States? The poor people? No. Corporations. Corporations just got the biggest tax break. So who does that help? Does that help the poor people?
Also, for people working for them.
Some of them got bonuses, but then they fired a bunch of them so that they could have enough money to. I know, I was looking at that on the internet. Yeah. So poor people are kind of SOL, where L stands for luck, right? Okay. And to discriminate the people. So if you're a poor homosexual Mexican American of African race female, wow, you're SOL on big time because you've got everything in the world going against you as far as white Americans are concerned. Anyway, all right. Many leading scholars have a more eclectic approach to the concept of psychology by accepting the complexity of abnormal behavior and supporting the biological, the psychological, and the sociocultural concepts, so that they accept them all. There are schools of thought out there. There are schools of psychology. And we keep talking about this. Well, I keep talking about this. I keep having arguments with other psychologists over this. Because where they studied one type of psychology. And I studied a more eclectic approach. And I think there are good points in all of them. I worked in medicine for 30 years, so the biological is extremely important to me. The sociocultural is important. So when I wrote my dissertation, a lot of my dissertation, about a third of my references came from medicine. About a third of my references came from social work, the sociocultural aspect, and the other third came from psychology. Well, there are people out there that would just scream bloody murder because all of my references were not psychological references. I was looking at other disciplines and I was saying, this is good research. And they were saying, the only good research comes out of psychology. I know, that seems kind of odd, doesn't it? But the reality is, there's a lot of good research out there. You just have to read it to determine if it's any good or not. There's a lot of crap coming out of psychology. A lot of junk coming out of psychology. People are publishing their research only so that they can keep their jobs. And some of it's garbage. So you've got to be very discriminatory when you read somebody's research. It may be a pile of garbage. You may read research in another discipline and it may be good research. I mean, who's going to argue with Einstein? Are you really going to argue physics with Einstein? For one thing, he died in 1953, so I don't think we're going to argue with him at all. However, if we read Einstein, he makes a lot of sense. And just because he was a physicist and a mathematician, instead of a psychologist, maybe he knew what the hell he was talking about. This approach is sometimes called the biopsychosocial perspective because it recognizes the interplay between the three different perspectives. And of course, that is a more eclectic approach, and there are other individuals that are behaviorists, there are individuals that are cognitivists, and they want to only study in their own direction, in their psychology in their own direction. In the 1950s, the first psychotropic medications were developed. Psychotropic means mind-changing. So if I'm taking Prozac, it's a psychotropic. If I'm taking Xanax. It's a psychotropic. It's changing the way that I think. And that makes it a psychotropic. When I take ibuprofen, does anybody take ibuprofen? You get a headache, you take ibuprofen? Anybody? Nobody? Ibuprofen? Okay. Ibuprofen? Sometimes? Sure. I mean, if you've got you hurt your knee and you're limping around, you take ibuprofen and it goes away, right? But if I take ibuprofen, it makes me depressed. I know. So for me, ibuprofen is a psychotropic. It changes my mind. It changes the way my mind functions. So I can't take ibuprofen. Why the hell would I ever take a medication that makes me depressed? How stupid is that? Well, let me tell you, I used to, when I drank, and of course I don't do this very often. I've only been drunk 3 times. It only took me 3 times to figure it out. When I drink, I get depressed. So if I drink alcohol, it makes me depressed. And then I have a hangover the next day. Well, it only took me 3 times doing it. How stupid do you have to be? Should have taken 1 time for me to figure out, I don't think I'll do that again, because it hurts. How many times do you have to hit your finger with a hammer before you go, let's not do that anymore? That hurts. Okay. Well, that's what happened to me with alcohol. Okay. So alcohol is a psychotropic. Is alcohol a psychotropic for anybody else? Has anybody else ever had a beer and gotten happy? It's a depressant. For me, it's a really big time depressant. I don't get happy at all. I just get depressed. I'm one of those guys that cries in their beer. I'm a whiny-ass, unpleasant person when I drink. So I don't. I don't want to be depressed. Okay, so it's a psychotropic as far as I'm concerned. The first psychotropics developed were antipsychotic drugs, drugs that corrected disorganized thinking. What they were doing, they were looking, the word I was trying to think of last time was serendipity. They were looking for something that cured tuberculosis, and they found an antidepressant. And that was serendipitous. It means that they were looking for one thing and they actually found something else. Serendipity. I know, I couldn't think of the word serendipity was. I apologize. Anyway, okay, so antipsychotic drugs, they were looking for antipsychotics. And they found tricyclics and monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Well, as it turns out, they don't work on people with schizophrenia, but they do work on people that are depressed. And that was a serendipitous discovery. But the first things that they were looking for were antipsychotics, because they had all these people in all these mental hospitals, and they were trying to get them out of the hospital. They were trying to find a medication that would make them logically thinking, make them more lucid, take away their symptoms. So they were looking for antipsychotics. Antidepressants were the next to be developed, and mainly the antidepressants were discovered because it was a serendipitous thing. They were looking for a tuberculosis medication, they were looking for an anti-schizophrenic medication, and they found an antidepressant. But then we started looking for antidepressants, and then we discovered SSRIs. We found Prozac was the first antidepressant wasn't found serendipitously. SSRIs. And we actually looked for that one and found it. That was kind of exciting. Anti-anxiety drugs have been the last form of psychotropic to be developed. They reduce tension and worry. The reason that we weren't looking for them is because we didn't have anybody in the asylums that were overly anxious. They were all schizophrenic. They were all bipolar. Some of them were so depressed that we had to hospitalize them. Well, we didn't have anybody that was so anxious that we had to put them in a mental hospital. So we didn't look for them. We weren't looking for this medication, but we found it. And it was a medication that increased the GABA level and changed their anxiety level. But we'll talk about that later. The most numerous mental health care workers are social workers. So those of you who want to go into mental health care, there are more jobs in social work than any other field. As a matter of fact, there are so many social workers that there are more social workers than all other mental health care workers combined. So social work is one of the most numerous of the mental health care workers. Actually, it is the most numerous. I know, isn't that exciting? You're not excited. Unfortunately, they make diddly squat. I can't really define diddly squat, but it's not very much money, okay? There are social workers who do counseling. They are what we call LCSW, licensed clinical social workers, and they're able to counsel. People with masters in social work usually are able to counsel as well. So there are social workers who do counseling. Actually, social work, even though they're the most numerous field in mental health care, they didn't start until the 1950s. And the first social work program was at Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, West Lafayette, Indiana. Did I say Lafayette? Oh my God. It's West Lafayette. No, Hoosier, they gave you the wrong town. Oh my God. The second most numerous mental health care worker are psychologists, of course. These people are primarily counselors and usually have a PhD. It all depends on the state that you're in. If you're planning on being a counselor off the reservation, then you'll probably have to have a PhD. If you have a PhD, you don't have to worry about it. You can go anywhere and get licensed in that state. But if you want to just counsel on the reservation, probably a master's degree in counseling will get you there. If you are living in Montana, you can do counseling as a social worker, as odd as that seems.
If you get licensed through the VA, then you can transfer anywhere in the United States.
Yeah,
as long as you're working in the VA.
Yeah, as long as you don't leave the VA, you can. In essence, that's a federal license, but it's only a federal license to practice on a federal reservation. That's strange as I'm saying. Yeah, the VA works that way. That's kind of cool as far as that's concerned. But then again, as a working for the VA, it's kind of a special because you're dealing with a lot of PTSD.
I think it's because of the pay they offer too. They have a hard time retaining people, so they really have to try to protect for retention.
Well, they have the same problem with IHS doctors. It's really hard for them. They don't really pay that well. They can make more money on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Well, some do
So,
to get the practice too.
Yeah. And it's tough. Yeah, this is a very special population with very special problems. Diabetes, for example. Marriage and family therapists became a profession in the 1940s along with psychologists. The least numerous mental health care workers are medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy, MDs and DOs that specialize in psychology. These are known as psychiatrists. Does anybody know what a DO program? Do you understand what a DO program is? It's the same thing as an MD program, except it's shorter and they're more holistic. Medical school is 4 years. DO school is usually 2.5 to 3 years. But they're a little bit different. They're also taught how to do chiropractic, which is kind of interesting. They can manipulate your bones, your joints.
Do they specialize in like hypnotics?
The DOs? None that I've ever met. DOs tend to be, doctors are trained to use medicine to fix people. DOs are trained to look at the entire person. They're more holistic. So they'll look at your social situation, they'll look at your family situation, and they'll try to determine if that has something to do with your problems. Whereas an MD goes into the room, you tell him, well, I don't feel very good, I'm kind of unhappy. He says, here, take some Prozac. That's it. So he's not as holistic. He doesn't care about your family life, that kind of thing. Some doctors are good, some doctors are good. All right. I say some of them are good. 75% of all bachelor's degrees in psychology are awarded to women. And you may wonder, what the hell are you doing here? If almost all the people that graduate from psychology programs are female, what are you doing in the program? Well, I'm one of the 25%. That's why I'm doing it. Why did I study psychology? You want the truth, or do you want me to blow some smoke in a strange place? What do you want? You want the truth? You want the truth? You can't handle the truth. No. The reason I studied psychology is because I was stationed at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas. And I don't know if you've ever been to Lubbock. There isn't anything in Lubbock. Well, there's Lubbock, but there's nothing for 200 miles in any direction. So Lubbock is like it's like out in the middle of the desert. It's out in the middle of the Llano Estacado. That's where it is. Yeah, it's isolated. So I was stationed in Lubbock, Texas, at Reese Air Force Base. They had 2 master's programs. I wanted a master's degree. They had 2 master's programs. One was in business, and the other one was in psychology. And I took a business class, and it was, my God, so boring. I can't imagine how those people teach. It's got to be the most boring thing in the world. So then I took psychology, and it was the only other program. So that's how I became a psychologist. It was less boring than business. And I wasn't that interested. What I was interested in was political science. I wanted to be a political science instructor. No, politics is exciting. I mean, every day something's happening. Something new is happening. It's so exciting. And now that we have all this fake news, wow, it gets even more exciting. Anyway, so that's how I became a psychologist. I got my master's degree in Texas, yeah. Lubbock, Texas, my God. But at the time, of course, I was in the Air Force. I was enlisted, and I was in a master's program. I was in class with all of these officers because they had to get a master's degree. I just wanted a master's degree. It's really kind of interesting. 66% of all advanced degrees in psychology are awarded to women. So if you're female and you're studying psychology, you're going to have a lot of company. There's a lot of individuals studying psychology who are female. 77% of all social workers are women. So there you go. 48% of all psychologists are women. 55% of all marriage counselors are women. But only 25% of all psychiatrists are women. And that's because you have to get a medical degree before you can study psychiatry. And that is the way it is. Now, interestingly enough, we have talked about a number of theorists. How many of them were women? 0. I know. Very few female theorists. I will probably talk about one, maybe 2. Freud's daughter and Karen Horney. But other than that, all the rest of them were male. And it may have something to do with the fact that women have babies and then they drop out for a while and then they come back. That may change things. And of course, things are changing in the world today. Things are changing. The whole Me Too thing, for the longest time, women were being molested and nobody was saying anything about it. But now all of a sudden they are. And that's a good thing. Maybe we can actually stop these jerks from doing all this horrible stuff that they've been doing for like ever. Yeah, maybe we can get that stopped. We'll see what happens next. I have no idea. So that's the end of chapter 2. So those of you who are keeping score, I'm caught up. I know, I'm so good. Wait a minute, let's go to chapter 3. This is the 3rd week. And here I am starting chapter 3. Sheldon's in the back of the room going, my God, he's never been caught up, ever. All these classes I've taken. I know, thanks, Sheldon. I'm doing good. Okay. Chapter 3, Contemporary Frameworks, whatever the hell that means. Let's see what that does mean. The first perspective that we dealt with was a biological perspective. And the reason the biological perspective was the first one in psychology, you have to remember that psychology has been thought of as a philosophy for an extended length of time. If you go to Indiana University and you're looking for psychology texts, you have to go to the philosophy section to find Freud, to find Adler, to find anybody. You have to go up to the philosophy section because in the beginning, psychology was considered a philosophy. But the reality is the first people that were psychologists were doctors. They knew that they had all these sick people, but they also knew that some of these sick people really weren't sick. They could throw all the medicine at them that they wanted, but it wasn't making them any better. Remember, Freud had those two interesting ladies. One of them went hysterically blind, and one of them went paralyzed from the waist down, not because that something physical had happened to them, but because they saw something, because they felt something. As stupid as that sounds. And this is what he had to deal with. He was a neurologist, and he knew that there was nothing wrong with them physically. He knew that they shouldn't be paralyzed. She shouldn't have been paralyzed. He knew that the other lady had nothing wrong with her eyes. She shouldn't be blind. But here she couldn't see anything. Is guilt really that strong that it can make you blind? It can make you paralyzed? What kind of religion teaches you to have physical symptoms for doing something that you're not supposed to do? Religions, what are we going to do with them? I know. Anyway, so almost all the first psychologists were doctors, and that's why they came up with the biological perspective. In the old days, when I first started in psychology, the individuals suffering from mental illness were our patients. And we were looking for diseases that they had. Mental illnesses were considered diseases. So we were looking for symptoms. I mean, right out of medicine. Why? Because Freud was a doctor. Adler was a doctor. All these people were doctors. I think Jung was a doctor as well. So the biological perspective looks at the structure of the brain. And when we talk about the structure of the brain, the first thing that we have to talk about is the neuron, which makes up the brain. There are trillions of neurons in our body. So we have to look at the neuron. The neuron is a structure of communication throughout the nervous system. And because of that, of course, we have to look at the neuron and determine what is going on. We have come up with medications to treat people because of the structure of the neuron. The neuron not only coordinates all movement and responses, but all thought as well. So when have you ever awakened at night because you thought you heard somebody yelling your name? It turned out there wasn't anybody out there. So who was yelling your name? Your name was bouncing around in your head. That's where it was. It was a neuron. Your neurons were firing, and they thought they heard somebody yelling your name. Has that ever happened to anybody? And you woke up scared to death because somebody's yelling at you outside. No? It's never happened to anybody but me? Maybe I'm insane. Maybe there's something wrong with me. All neurons have the same basic structure. All cells in the body have a nucleus. The nucleus of the neuron is in the soma. Soma means body. So anything that has to do with soma means that it is body-shaped or has something to do with the body. So if something's somatic, it's from the body. The portion of the neuron that provides the care and the maintenance of the neuron, of course, is the soma, and that's where we find the nucleus. And without the nucleus, of course, we don't have a cell. So we have to visualize just where the soma is. It's right there, protecting and taking care of the neuron. Information is collected by short, fibery projections from the soma called dendrites, which look like the branches of a tree. And it's collecting information from other neurons, or from other sources, from other forms of stimuli. If the dendrites are the branches, then the axon is the trunk. And the axon, you can tell the axon, there's usually just one of them, and it connects the soma to the dendrites. And that is known as the axon. Or we can call it the trunk if we want. Information is collected by the dendrites, passes through the soma into the axon to the axon terminal, where the information is passed on to another neuron or to an organ or maybe to a muscle. So that's what the neuron does. It communicates with something. It communicates with another neuron, it communicates with an organ, or it communicates with a muscle. At the axon terminal, most neurons branch to pass on more information, so they'll branch out at that point and connect to more muscles or to more organs or to whatever. So we're trying to communicate. It's a form of communication. Each branch of the axon ends in a swelling called a knob. Knobs do not touch the receiving neuron or the organ, but have an open space between themselves and the structure known as a synaptic cleft. So neurons do not touch. If neurons touch, they would short each other out. And that doesn't happen very often. Then that area would go numb or whatever. But there is an opening. There's a gap between the neuron and whatever it's communicating with. And that's known as the synaptic cleft. This becomes very important because we're going to try to determine, going to try to develop medication that will affect the movement of chemicals between the neuron and whatever it's connecting to. So we can block your pain by interrupting the chemicals in that synaptic cleft. We can we can increase your GABA level and take away your anxiety just by interrupting the chemicals in that synaptic cleft. We can increase the amount of serotonin that stays in the synaptic cleft. And if we can do that, it makes you feel happier than you were before. So if you're depressed, we can give you Prozac. It's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And we can increase the amount of serotonin in that synaptic cleft, and we can make you feel better. It takes a while, but we can make you feel better. It takes a couple of weeks for the level to get up to that point. So we can fix you if we can manipulate the chemicals in that synaptic cleft. And that's really kind of exciting, if you think about it. I have no rationale as to why I get depressed on ibuprofen. Nobody knows. About 5% of the population. That's not right. It's 11% of the population. Has the same problem that I have. I'm not sensitive to opiates. I can take OxyContin, it doesn't touch me. I can get a shot of morphine, I can't even feel it. Now, this can be a problem. About 5% of the population has the same problem that I have. We're not sensitive to opiates or opioids, so they don't work. So when they knocked me out for my surgery, instead of giving me morphine, they gave me fentanyl. They were supposed to give me a bolus of fentanyl and morphine. The morphine's supposed to make you forget, and the fentanyl's supposed to knock you out. But they had to give me a double bolus of fentanyl. Now, who do we know that just died from taking too much fentanyl? Tom Petty, that heartbreaker. Just died from taking too much fentanyl. Prince died because he took fentanyl. He died twice, actually. He died on an airplane, and he landed. They landed at the nearest airport. Just turned out to be the airport right beside my house, right near my house, the Quad City Airport. I know, it was kind of exciting. Took him to the hospital and brought him back. A couple days later, he overdosed again, and this time he died in his elevator, which is kind of sad. Fentanyl. It's 100 times stronger than morphine. I know, it's kind of exciting. So, if we can manipulate the synaptic cleft, the chemicals in the synaptic cleft, we can change your mind, as exciting as that is. So, let's get high, dudes. Let's shoot up with some crystal meth. Let's smoke some crack. Let's smoke some pot. What does that do? It changes the chemicals in your synaptic cleft. And that's why you get high. Okay. So it can do good things, it can do bad things. Information is passed in the open synaptic cleft by chemicals known as neurotransmitters. And I talked about GABA. If we can increase your GABA level, it makes you less anxious. It takes away your anxiety. And that is a neurotransmitter. I talked about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Serotonin is a chemical a neurotransmitter that makes you feel happy. So if we can increase the serotonin level, we can make you feel better. We can make you feel happier. And those are both neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters pass between the two structures and are gathered in areas on the receiving structure called receptor sites. The reception of the neurotransmitter causes a chemical imbalance to occur in the receiving structure, creating an electrical reaction. So there's a reason why the serotonin is in the synaptic cleft. There's a reason why the GABA is in the synaptic cleft. Now we have to increase that amount of serotonin or GABA in order to make you feel less anxious or less depressed. Not all of the neurotransmitter released in the synaptic cleft is needed or will be used. So it releases a lot more than it needs. So rather than leave too much in there and having your neurons spasm, we have to remove some of that neurotransmitter so that the neuron stops reacting to it. So we do that in two different ways. We either do that by taking it back into the neuron that released it to begin with, reuptake, or we break it down with a chemical. Acetylcholine if acetylcholine is in the synaptic cleft, we have to break it down chemically, and we do that with acetylcholinesterase. It's an enzyme that breaks down the acetylcholine. So, and acetylcholine allows you to move. So, as I'm walking around, the acetylcholine, I need a proper amount of acetylcholine for my steps to be uniform or whatever, so that I can move. If there's too much acetylcholine, I don't stop walking and I run right into your table, and that wouldn't be good at all. But so I need to control that acetylcholine, and I do that with acetylcholinesterase. However, okay, so the reuptake, I told you about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The SSRIs block the reuptake of serotonin. So it puts more serotonin into the synaptic cleft, making you feel better. So it blocks the reuptake of serotonin. Isn't that exciting? It is for me, because this stuff really works. Before we had SSRIs, what did we use to make people not depressed anymore? We used two chemicals. One of them was called tricyclics. And tricyclics actually worked. I mean, they increased the serotonin level, but the problem was that the tricyclics are toxic. They're very toxic. So they were destroying people's livers. Well, if we had a depressed teenager and we had to give them tricyclics, by the time he's 40 years old, we've blown his liver up. I know, this is a tragedy. Or we could have given them monoamine oxidase inhibitors. This stuff works. It raises your norepinephrine level, makes you feel better. However, you can't eat beans if you take this. It raises your blood pressure. You take monoamine oxidase inhibitors. You can't eat beans. You can't drink wine. You can't eat olives. If you do, you kill yourself. So there were a lot of dietary restrictions with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. But with the SSRIs, there's hardly anything. We have hardly any problems. No side effects from SSRIs. So we're really excited about that. There is one side effect, but most people don't complain about it. The side effect is that it reduces your sexual drive, your sex drive. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because testosterone in your hypothalamus controls your sex drive. It tells you when you're horny and when you're not horny. Can I say horny? I guess I can't. Okay. It tells you when you're horny and when you're not horny. That's testosterone. In order to keep people from having sex all the time, because of the testosterone, it is tempered with serotonin. So you have serotonin that is controlling the sex drive in your hypothalamus. Okay, are you getting the picture? Mm-hmm. Testosterone gives us our sex drive. Serotonin keeps us from pumping the wall.
Oh my God.
I said that on the video, didn't I?
What's it called again?
I used to work at the big college.
I was writing down.
Okay, so serotonin controls that. So if we increase the serotonin, potentially some of that gets into your hypothalamus, and potentially that can cause impotence. But most people don't complain about the impotence. So we're okay. All right. All right, so we're talking about neurotransmitters. My God, I said hump on the video. Oh my
You
God.
said horny.
I didn't say horny. Neurotransmitters can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Abnormally low or high levels of select neurotransmitters are present in select instances of abnormal behavior. Acetylcholine controls your muscle contraction and is present in memory formation. So we need acetylcholine in order to remember things. The death of the acetylcholine producing cells in the brain leads to Alzheimer's disease. We know this. So we need acetylcholine. We need it to be able to move, and we need it to be able to remember things. So we've got buckets and buckets of this stuff in our brains, and we're okay, because we can remember things. But if those cells that produce acetylcholine ever die, now we've got Alzheimer's disease, and we eventually die also. And the reason we die is because we don't remember to breathe. Usually we gag to death. I know it sounds horrible. But you can't swallow anymore. And that's what usually kills people. They choke to death. As sad as that sounds. Dopamine regulates muscle contractions in the body and maintains learning, memory, and emotions in the brain. Dopamine is our pleasure center. So when we take something that makes us feel good, like alcohol, one of the things it does is it increases the dopamine level. What else are we taking that increases? Oh, alcohol increases our dopamine level. Cigarettes increases our dopamine level. Crack cocaine increases our dopamine level, almost instantaneously. And it's one of the reasons why it's so addictive. Nicotine, of course, is one of the most addictive substances known to man. Every time you take a puff of that cigarette, you get a dopamine spike in your brain. And it makes you feel good. In many cases, schizophrenia can be alleviated by giving individual medication that blocks dopamine receptor sites. So we know that too many dopamine receptor sites causes people to have schizophrenia. So if we can give you a medication that blocks those receptor sites, almost all schizophrenia goes away. But not all schizophrenia goes away, as odd as that seems. So it's not absolute. Okay. But usually it will go away. The symptoms. So all we have to do is block those dopamine receptor sites. Norepinephrine aids in learning and memory. Excess amounts can lead to mania, while decreased amounts lead to some forms of depression. So dopamine makes us feel good. Norepinephrine makes us feel good. We have too much of it, we feel too good. We start acting crazy. We start acting wild. If we have too little of it, we become depressed. And that's norepinephrine. Tricyclics work on both norepinephrine and serotonin. Both of them make us feel good. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors work on norepinephrine only, not on serotonin. Serotonin regulates our moods, it communicates satiation, and it regulates sleep. Reduced serotonin leads to depression and eating disorders. And this is kind of weird because we can give somebody with an eating disorder, with anorexia, we can give them Prozac. It doesn't work. I know, this is kind of weird. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that is affected by alcohol. So if you've ever known anybody who has to have a drink in order to feel good, they're increasing their serotonin level, and that makes them feel good. They're artificially increasing their serotonin level. So when they don't drink, now their serotonin level is too low. And And now in order to feel normal, what they have to do is take another drink of alcohol. This is the way the body works. It tries to protect itself. And if we overstimulate it, these neurons will lose some of their receptor sites in order to protect themselves.
Homeostasis.
I'm sorry?
Homeostasis.
Right, that's what it's seeking. It's seeking homeostasis. So what you should do is stay away from that stuff. So if you take anything that overstimulates you, then those neurons will try to protect themselves by reducing the number of receptor sites. Okay, so let's pretend that we like to drink a lot of alcohol. And when we drink a lot of alcohol, our neurons are trying to protect themselves. And they protect themselves by reducing the number of receptor sites. So now we decide to go cold turkey, we're not going to drink anymore. So guess what happens next? You go back to a point of homeostasis? No, you go in the other direction. No. Now you don't have enough receptor sites. So you can't feel good. You can't feel normal. And that's what happens when you drink too much. You have to drink in order just to feel normal. A lot of people, that's why they drink. Because unless they're drunk, they don't feel normal because they don't have enough receptor sites.
So they feel abnormal?
You don't have enough receptor sites. So you do feel abnormal, you feel depressed.
Or if they drink, they have to have a sleep.
Right, yeah, I know, it's weird, isn't it? Because alcohol doesn't really, well, it does kind of work on dopamine. But if you drink and smoke at the same time, you're getting a double shot. Double shot of my babies. Wow, man, I'll tell you what. Okay. That's good stuff. I had a friend that she didn't drink beer very often, but when she drank beer, she had to smoke. And I could never figure that out because she smelled like... You know what ashtray is. And I tried not to kiss her, but if I did, it tasted, wow. Tasted like somebody urinated in that ashtray. Let me tell you, it was nasty. You write that down. Urinate on the ashtray.
So be on the test.
The main focus of abnormal behavior is the central nervous system made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Here's the weird thing, she never smoked unless she was drinking. I don't know if that's weird or not. It seems strange to me. She never smoked, and she hardly ever drank, but when she drank, she had to smoke. It didn't make any sense. The portion of the brain closest to, and then she got, well, I won't tell you. I'm not going to use that word again. I'm not going to use that word either. The portion of the brain closest to the spinal cord is the hindbrain. The hindbrain is comprised of the medulla, pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla regulates heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, sneezing, sleep, and coughing. The pons controls body movement, attention, sleep, and respiration. The cerebellum regulates muscle tone, balance, and coordination. They're all right back here. Once upon a time, I used to work in a hospital in Omaha, and we were the one. Oh, jeez, what a horrible job I had. We were the ones that harvested organs. Okay. So if somebody came in who was brain dead, they sent them to our hospital. We harvested their organs and sent them downtown, which was like 2 blocks down the road. We sent them to another hospital and they transplanted them. And we saved lots of lives that way. The ugly thing was that we got the bodies, okay? We got the cadavers. These guys were brain dead. A lot of times at this point this was in Omaha. And Omaha is on the Missouri River. Across the Missouri River is Iowa. Iowa didn't have a helmet law. So these guys would fall off the backs of their motorcycles, and your head is really heavy, and your neck isn't very strong. So if they fell off the backs of their motorcycles, their heads would go back, and when they hit the pavement, the skull would crush into their medulla, and sometimes it'd get into their pons. And now they're brain dead because they can't move. They can't regulate their own blood pressure. You have to put them on a heart monitor. They can't sneeze, so they can't clear their airways. They can't cough, so they can't clear their airways, and they're brain dead. Yeah. So these are the guys that we got. Yeah, okay. Are you getting the picture? So it was because their skulls they were bending their heads way, way back, and when they hit the pavement, their skull would smash into their pons and their medulla, and it would make them brain dead. I know, it's horrible. And they couldn't maintain themselves, so we had to do that for them. That was our job. It looked like a scene out of some horror movie, I'll tell you what, it was ugly. Not only that, but I worked in the morgue, damn it. And so these guys, after we harvested all the organs, yeah, they came down to the morgue. But we'd get them all. It was kind of sad. Anyway, can I stop? Okay. Is anybody offended? Have I offended anybody yet? It was my job, right? You guys didn't have to do it. The midbrain is a pathway between the hindbrain and the forebrain. One system that runs through all three areas of the brain is the reticular activating system. The RAS plays a role in sleep, attention, and arousal. Injury to this area will lead to the individual to a state of unconsciousness or being comatose. So that was part of the problem as well. Not only were these people, well, they were brain dead, but they were also comatose. Even if there wasn't as extensive damage, sometimes they'd be in comas for years, literally. They didn't stay in our hospital. As soon as we discovered that they weren't going to die and that there was brain activity, we would ship them to another hospital. We harvested organs. What a god-awful thing to do. Sounds so macabre, doesn't it? No, I didn't do it. All I did was draw their blood, okay? I wasn't the one cutting anything out. The forebrain is made up of the cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia. The interesting thing about this is it is not only the outside of your brain, but it's the very middle of your brain. That's what, all this stuff is the most protected areas of your brain. Your limbic system, your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your basal ganglia. The cerebrum, of course, is the outer covering. And the outer covering is the outside of your brain. This is where all the thinking takes place. Your thalamus is involved in sleep and attention, and it relays sensory information to other parts of your brain. It's kind of like Denver. You fly into Denver, then you fly to wherever you really want to go. Nobody wants to go to Denver. It's a hub, and that's kind of what the thalamus does. It sends information to different parts of your brain, but it's just a central location where everything comes into, kind of like Denver or Chicago or Atlanta. Okay. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus make up your limbic system. This has to do with your memory. It has to do with maintaining your entire body. Remember I said your sex drive takes place in the hypothalamus. And there it is. Now the interesting thing about the hypothalamus, well, that's not that interesting, I guess. It's right in the middle of your brain, your hypothalamus. It's right here. It's right underneath everything. It's so protected by everything. The whole brain structure protects your hypothalamus. You can't get shot in the hypothalamus. But I had a friend who had a brain tumor, and they were trying to kill it with radiation. And guess what they hit instead of the tumor? I know, they hit his hypothalamus. I know. So he had to take all these amazing, he had to take a handful of medication every day just to maintain himself. He also had a hole in his head, a real soft spot, like a baby, right there. And they had to take out the skull. They had melted it to begin with. Just crazy stuff, I know. Doctor, see, that's what I'm telling you about, doctor. Something wrong with him. The hypothalamus is the most important gland in your body. And there it is. It's right here, right in the middle of your brain. It's located between the thalamus and the pituitary. It controls the regulation of body temperature, the concentration of fluids, the storage of nutrients, motivation, your hunger drive, your thirst drive, your sex drive, your concept of parenting, and your aggression. Now remember, this guy had to take a whole handful of pills just to be normal every day. He had to regulate all these things with medications. The one problem he had was aggression. I know, sometimes he would just go off. It was so weird. So I was sitting in my, we had the same office, and our backs were to one another. His was in one corner, mine was in the other. We weren't that far apart. And here he is, he's working on his computer, and he can't get something done. So call IT, you know. Is that what he did? No, hell no. He took his, the board he was typing on, what do they call it? Keyboard. Took the keyboard and he slammed it down on the table. There were A's and C's and Q's and 1s and 2s flying all over the room. You know, and I'm getting pelted with all these things. You know, 1 second he's fine, and the next second he crushes this keyboard and it's all over the room. And, you know, I'm ducking. You know, and here I am, a military veteran, and I'm under assault, right? So I jumped up, looking for, you know, I don't know, an earthquake or something like that.
I think that's,
Or,
it was because.
or the Viet Cong.
I think it's because you're Air Force.
Anyway, so he's so pissed off, and he's looking at me like he wants to tear me into little bitty pieces, exactly. He wants to tear me into little bitty pieces. So, you know, I'm looking at him, and he goes, whoops, what in the world am I assaulted? You know, it's one of those kind of deals. And he quieted down, ran out of the building, and he went outside, he ran up and down the street, and everything. He came back and apologized for assaulting me with A's and Q's and whatnot. Okay. I felt sorry for him after I realized what was going on. I mean, these things are falling out of the air. It was really kind of bizarre. Anyway, his aggression. He couldn't control his aggression or his emotion. Eventually, he got married. We won't go into that. Okay. He's not married anymore, okay? The outer surface of the cerebrum is where all of your higher order thinking takes place. This is known as your cerebral cortex. It's the outside 1/8 of an inch of your brain. Connecting the two hemispheres of the brain is a thick fiber called the corpus callosum. This is where you communicate. The corpus callosum is where the communication between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere takes place. Most women have a larger corpus callosum than men. This allows you to communicate between your two hemispheres much more readily. So there are select things that can happen to a female that she will recover from a lot faster than a male will. One of them is a stroke. Usually if a part of your brain dies, then in order for you to regain the function from that area, in order for you to regain that function, you have to recircuit your brain. Women recover from strokes much faster than men do because of the communication between your left and right hemispheres. How about that? I know, it's kind of irritating. Anyway. Chromosomes are elongated bodies in the cells that carry genetic information. We are human, therefore we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 chromosomes. Genes are units of hereditary information carried in a chromosome by DNA. Alleles are alternate forms of genes that we may potentially have. So what gives you the color of eyes that you have? It's an allele. It tells you what color of eyes you're going to have. Sometimes alleles are expressed, sometimes they are not. Sometimes they're recessive and sometimes they are dominant. And that's the way it works. A person's genotype is the total set of inherited characteristics determined by a person's genetic makeup. So that's your genotype. It's everything, whether it's expressed or not expressed, is your genotype. Now this isn't really very important unless, the only thing that's really important is your expressed genes, right? It gives you the color of your eyes, it gives you the tone of your skin, it tells you how long your nose is going to be. Only your expressed genes are important. Unless you need a blood transfusion, or unless you need an organ transplant. Then it becomes extremely important what the hidden genes are, the ones that aren't expressed. If you need a blood transfusion, sometimes your genotype will tell you that you can't just have O positive, but you have a certain genotype that needs O positive whatever. You need another thing. You need one more thing. Because if we try to give you blood that's just O positive and doesn't have the allele, this other allele, then you'll have a reaction to the blood. And potentially it will kill you. And certainly if we're looking at an organ transplant, we need to make sure that we're not going to put something in your body that your body's going to reject. First of all, it's a waste of an organ. And second of all, it might kill you. It could potentially kill you. So we certainly don't want to do that. So your genotype is actually only important if you're hurt or if you need something. And I've already talked about the phenotype being the observable characteristics. We all know what these are because we can look at you, we can tell that your hair is black, or we can tell that your eyes are brown, or we can tell that your lips are full, or we can tell that you're taller than me, 5'7", you're 5'7" instead of 5'6". You can tell that just by looking. Phenotypes are the observable genes, and the genotype normally is the unexpressed genes. But like I said, sometimes the unexpressed genes can be important. There are two types of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins. Identical twins are from the same zygote. They're monozygotic. In other words, they come from the same zygote. Sometimes they inhabit the same placenta. So there will be two babies growing inside the same placenta. Sometimes we can have identical twins, but they have separate placentas. And of course that changes everything. Changes a lot of different things. Normally if two babies are born inside the same placenta, that is exactly the same environment. And not only are they identical, but they'll be identical in a lot of other ways as well. But if they are from the same ova, they have the same DNA, but if they are raised in different environments, then one can be larger than the other. One can get nutrients that the other one doesn't get. So they're not exactly as identical as they potentially could be. A dizygotic twin is a twin that is born at the same time as its sibling, but they come from two different ova. So with a dizygotic twin, you can have different genders. With an identical twin, they have to be the same gender. But a dizygotic twin are two different separate ova, except they're growing in the same abdomen, I guess, because usually they're in separate placentas. It is assumed that the differences in degree of behavioral similarity between identical and fraternal twins will be largely due to the greater genetic similarity of the identical twins, given that both monozygotic and dizygotic twins share roughly equal environments. But of course, when we talk about placenta, we're talking about something totally different. When I was working in, where was it? Vienna, Virginia, at a pediatrics clinic, we had a lady that came in with her triplets. She had two boys and one girl. And the girl was about half the size of the two boys when she was born, because she was the runt. She was getting the hind teeth. She was not getting as many nutrients as the two boys were. And pretty soon they had grown to the extent that they were keeping her from getting nutrition. And so there were a lot of interesting problems. They were able to save the little girl, but she grew up as smaller than the two boys. She had developmental problems that the two boys didn't have. But it was the fact that in the womb, the environment was totally different as far as the three of them were concerned. The two boys were identical. This is weird. The two boys were identical, but of course the girl couldn't possibly be identical. They didn't even know she existed until like she was 6 months. The lady was 6 months pregnant. I know. It looked like, well, the little girl was about half the size of the two boys. And of course she wasn't getting the same nutrition. After that they tried to move the boys. They tried to keep them from pinching off her umbilical cord. They weren't very successful, and they actually had to go in and do a cesarean section early, but they wanted to leave the girl in so that she could develop more, but it didn't work that way. They had to take all three of them at the same time, but they didn't think the little girl was going to make it. Another method of assessing genetic influence is to compare children who have been removed from their biological parents at or shortly after birth and adopted or raised by foster parents. If an adoptee is more like the adopting parents than the biological parents, we infer environmental influences. Obviously, it must be the environment, because it has nothing to do with biology. If the adoptee is more like the biological parent than the adopted parent, we infer genetic influence, because they have never been around the biological parents, yet they're acting like the biological parents. They're reacting like the biological parents do. So we assume that it is a genetic, something genetic rather than something environmental. For most behavioral traits, genes may account for about half of the variability between people, while environmental factors account for the other half. So whoever you are, no matter who you are, half of the way that you are is genetic, and the other half has to do with the environment that you were raised in. Calculations of heritability do not tell us to what extent either genetics or environment causes a trait, nor whether any individual will develop the trait, because biological traits are influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. So if we just look at somebody, we can't say, well, you have ADHD, you're acting that way because of genes. We can't say that, because some of it may have to do with environment. ADHD is one of those problems that can be either genetic or it can be environmental. Maybe you weren't nobody paid attention to you. So in order for you to get attention from your parents, you had to act out. And now they have diagnosed your acting out as ADHD. Whereas the reality is that the reason you act this way is because your parents wouldn't pay any attention to you. I know. Bizarre, isn't it? 4:20, right? Yeah. What time do you guys? My heart rate is 98. Oh, wait. 4:19. Okay. Why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. Right here, talking about estimates of genetic influence.